All right, so now we're going to look at Christian humanism. So we've discussed this idea of the late medieval era into this Renaissance period as a time of great religious corruption. As the church no longer was set to reform, the church has moved away from its roots, and now we're going to see the ideology that pointed to that corruption, and that's going to be Christian humanism. We talked about this in the Renaissance art with Peter Bruegel, the elder. But now let's look at this idea. What was Christian humanism? Christian humanism was the Northern humanism which sought to root out Catholic corruption. Really important. The Northern Renaissance, these Christian humanists went to the original manuscripts of the first church, the first century church that predated Catholicism. It was before Rome was Rome and the Pope had all this authority in the religiousness. And they were like, what did the original church, the church that may have known Jesus directly, or at least was within generations of the life of Jesus, how do they operate church? And by doing so, it really upended some of the Catholic dogma that was wrong. And we see that. Christian humanists recognized the corruption of the papacy and the theological fallacies of the medieval Catholic Church. Those fallacies are just problems of the church. For example, the Christian humanists realized that the Catholic Bible called the Vulgate was actually translated incorrectly. As they went to the original documents and they began to kind of compare the Vulgate, which is the Catholic medieval Bible, they realized there were some glaring errors in which were being taught. So they want to fix those errors. Additionally, they begin to identify there were things about the Catholic dogma or beliefs that was created by the actual church as it developed rather than being founded in the original Bible or the text that they surrounded. So these Christian humanists are really important. Additionally, the Christian humanists pointed out church corruption and called for religious reform. My favorite example is this anonymous flyer. We do think it was by a guy named Erasmus, but the anonymous flyer that kind of went throughout Northern Europe was Julius excluded from heaven. Well, this was a really interesting satire that was put out, and the whole point of Julius excluded from heaven was they were arguing that Pope Julius in his death was in hell. And this was something that the average person couldn't really comprehend because for them, the Pope is the vicar of Christ. So clearly that he is going to be in heaven. But one of these elements is very famous or infamous, whatever side you're on, satire that kind of spread was Julius excluded from heaven. And it really uprooted a lot of the corruption of Julius as the warrior pope, some of the other elements. And it became a really important document that spread throughout. So they're pointing out the corruption, challenging that paradigm. And now we're going to identify the two most important Christian humanists for us. First is Thomas More. Thomas More was an English humanist, and he demonstrated civic humanism as he served King Henry VIII. We're going to talk a little bit about him later. He's a really significant humanist. And he published a book called Utopia. Here we see an original copy. I get this from Wikipedia. Just they had in their Wikipedia Commons, they had a common access to one of the title pages, and you can kind of see what this book's about. It's an island, and it's a satire, which a satire uses humor to bring up to point out the problems of society. It was a satire in which he used Utopia, a fictional island, to criticize the greed of England and the corruption of the English church. So in Utopia, he challenged the idea of private property. He challenged the idea of the estate system and class structure. And again, I think if you go back and you try to read it's not funny for us because we are not in that time or space. That time and space is so important. But Utopia became a very important book that actually transcended England and went throughout northern Germany and the Netherlands as well, as Thomas More's close friend, Erasmus, Deciduous Erasmus, Erasmus is probably the most important Christian humanist, as they called him the Prince of Humanists. He was a Dutch humanist from the Netherlands. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, why that's important. And he translated the Greek New Testament to fix the Catholic errors of that Vulgate. So he's an expert in theology, religious beliefs, and he goes into it and he's trying to figure out where is the corruption of the church, and they really believe he found it in the Vulgate. His most famous book, here you see a more modern interpretation, but it's called Praise of Folly. And I really like this title because you see the court jester there. And he really, Erasmus is going to use this satire to make fun of what he thought was silly church dogma. He thought much of this Catholic dogma was based on traditions rather than the actual manuscripts, and it was actually not really true, he argued. And he even pointed out the idea of the virgin birth didn't make sense to him. It wasn't what he thought was in the New Testament. As he concluded, much of the document was made up by the church and not found in the Bible. So here he is really, Praise of Folly really pushes the notion that Jesus as the Savior, and it says that might be error. He's more of a philosopher that teaches the way to live. And again, I think that's really important that you kind of write down there as we're evolving here. This is a satire, really, really famous. And again, I'm not memorizing these years, but I'm using these years to kind of help you understand that we're getting really close to 1517, which will be the first year for this unit to memorize. But Erasmus, he's calling attention using print culture to call attention to the errors of the church, the fallacy of the church, and calls people to reform the church. And before I move off this slide, I'm going to re-emphasize, historians have called him, Erasmus he laid the egg that Luther hatched. And we're going to see why that's important a little bit later. But Erasmus, these books would be read publicly in the town spaces, even where people were not able to read. And so this really transformed that paradigm. And again, that's the most significant work. And in addition to Christian humanism, we saw the rise of nationalism. And we've talked a little bit about the importance of the printing press. We're going to see the emergence of a standardized national vernacular language. Vernacular means everyday language. So now the merchants are organizing these new books based on the vernacular to help spread information. And these are going to be tied to the national languages. And as a historian, I do identify language as the most significant element of nationalism and a nation state. Without a national language, a vernacular language, there will be no concept of unity. That is one of my claims. I do want to make sure you understand that, but clearly I think this is important. As the kings began to centralize the state, kings realized that Christendom served as an obstacle to their goals. Who were the people going to be most loyal to? To the Pope or to the king? So the king, if he wants that loyalty, he has to change the concept of Christendom. So the king is going to assert a lot of this authority. And the English and Northern German nobles opposed the Italian domination of the church. If I'm English, why am I paying attention to a quote unquote dirty, rotten Italian? Especially as I begin to hear about their debauchery and their sins. I'm like, why am I listening to them? Northern German nobles, why are we listening to this church? So English and Northern German nobles begin to look for national leaders, they're national Christian leaders. And that's going to become the root of the the Church of England, as well as the regional churches that break Christendom during this time period. So again, these languages, this nationalism, very important. And I want to point out the French nobles and merchants, especially as a result of the Italian wars, they realized that much of the Valois dynasty was supported by the Pope. And you might say, "Was, you say that? Is there a document?" Of course there is. It is the Concordat of Bologna. I really like this year. It's not something I'm going to memorize, but I want to make sure you know it's the year right before 1517. The Concord of Bologna. The word concordat is an agreement between a king and a pope. And the Concord of Bologna, basically, you allowed the French king, the Valois monarch, to assert authority over the French Catholic Church. So now the French king, who's going to assert some political secular authority over the French Catholic Church, is going to wield as much, if not more, power than the Pope. The reason the Pope did this is because, remember, this is Francis the First. There's a lot of chaos going on. Charles the First is just emerging as the king of Spain, and there's this question like, what's going to happen here? So the Pope was hoping to cement an agreement with France to reduce the power of the Habsburgs. So if you need to write some of that down to remind yourself, totally cool. But the importance here is that Concord of Bologna basically centralized the church under the king's authority in France. And now French nobles and merchants are beginning to push against that. And they're going to identify themselves as French rather than Catholic, and it's going to create some chaos. But I hope I've proven enough here that this nationalism is not just a cultural element, it's also a political element. And lastly, for us, the rise of the merchants. We've already talked about Hansa and the trade fairs and the Flanders fleet of Venice. And as the economies are recovering, by the time we get to the 16th century, the European merchant classes, especially in England, in the Netherlands, as well as in northern Germany, have really secured their position, and they're beginning to think, how can we challenge things? And this really allows them to begin to rethink Christendom. We've already talked about why the Medici wanted to be free from Christendom, but the northern merchants absolutely wanted the same. They wanted to redefine usury. Usury is still excessive interest, it still is a word we use today. But remember, they wanted to define usury within the civic element. Rather than the Pope having power to define what interest was, what usury was, they wanted to define excessive interest within the civic sense, giving them economic independence over the Pope. Merchants in England, the Netherlands, and northern Germany sought religious reform to reduce power of the papacy. Really, this is going to be, we're going to see these movements led by the merchants. Not shockingly, the merchants control the printing press. So what are they going to be printing? Are they going to be printing Catholic support? Of course not. They're going to be printing support for the new, hip, modern paradigm. And that really brings us to our conclusion. By 1517, Northern Europe was fully prepared for religious reformation. They were tired of papal corruption. The hope of reform was crushed by the burning of Huss and the rise of the Renaissance papacy. Intellectually, they were intellectually thinking outside of Christendom. Rather than the Pope controlling their theology, the Christian humanists were providing a new set of understandings of Christianity. They were also prepared because of the waves of nationalism within England, France, and northern Germany. They were looking for a reduction of Italians, the Italian influences. Additionally, we're going to see some of the national kings take advantage of the opportunities of religious reforms. And lastly, but not least, the merchants pushed towards secularization. Yes, they controlled print culture, but they also wanted to create a civic based economy in which the Pope no longer had authority. So I think that is again a good summary of the causes. Right now, if you're in class, I'm hoping you pause and you rank the causes. I want you to identify the four in your row groups. I want you to describe which one's the most important. What was the most important? Make sure in your conversation you're using details. I'll be walking around to ensure that we're ready to rock and roll. And again, I hope that makes sense.